Well, it's an honor to be asked to speak, and I wanted to begin my talk on Detroit at risk of causing some confusion by reading two quotations that, unfortunately, all of us should be very familiar with. So just bear with me, I'm only making a point. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States. And another one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We've heard all these phrases before, probably many times, and we know that they have nothing to do with reality. The United States is not governed by we the people. It is governed by the billionaires and by the bankers. At the very time that these words were written about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, millions of people in the U.S. were in chains, and indigenous people were being slaughtered. It is only through centuries of struggle from the oppressed, from the working class, and from progressive forces that human chattel slavery was abolished, that women won the right to vote, and that labor unions were legalized. In modern times, the U.S. isn't sending drones to Africa and the Middle East to kill children because we the people want it. The government of the United States serves the small class of bankers in modern times, just as it served the small class of slave plantation owners at the time it was founded. The wars are waged to make Wall Street richer and to beat down any competitor or opposition that may emerge. One of the most disgusting things about the modern U.S. is that while so many are hungry, so many are unemployed, and so many ugly wars are being waged, the rhetoric continues about this being the greatest country on earth. It's nauseating at times. What's even more nauseating is the fact that this patriotism, this national chauvinism, sometimes even filters into the progressive movement. Many confused activists believe that these words are true, or just could be true if we pressured our leaders enough. If democracy, defined as the rule of the people, existed in the United States, the situation wouldn't be this way. There is dictatorship in the United States by the wealthy bankers who control the Democrats, the Republicans, the major media, the military, and the police. That's right. In ordinary times, this facade of democracy to conceal the rule of the wealthy works out quite well for the billionaire class. They continue to rule, enriching themselves, exploiting our labor, exploiting the labor of people all throughout the world, and they beat down the black and brown workers, while millions of others continue to walk around thinking that they are free. That's ordinary times. But we're not living in ordinary times. The defining aspect of the current period is the economic crisis. All throughout the Midwest, homes are foreclosed. Mass unemployment is reality. Low wages and short-term service sector jobs is what the new generation of young workers are being trained to expect as normal. One specific aspect of the current economic crisis is that the government, on order from the banks and the billionaires, are cutting social programs. They want to cut public education. They want to cut food stamps. They want to cut Social Security. They want to cut Medicaid. They want to cut the wages of government workers and the pensions of retired government workers. They want to raise tuition at public universities. Now, these cuts present a problem. Now, while we're often very frustrated with the level of consciousness among the majority of workers in the U.S., workers and people in general tend to not support their own starvation. People who receive food stamps are very unlikely to vote for abolishing food stamps. Teachers, school employees are highly unlikely to vote for the abolition of public education. So all this nauseating rhetoric, patriotic rhetoric about we the people, suddenly presents a big problem for the capitalists. They've ranted and raved about democracy and freedom so long, but in order to serve the needs of their own system, they're going to have to move toward abolishing basic democratic rights. The current crisis in Detroit is a prime example of this trend in capitalist society. The bankers couldn't count on the municipal government of Detroit to do what they wanted, so the elected government was removed. With the city declared bankrupt, the elected government, which Detroit residents voted for, was overturned, and in its place was put an emergency manager appointed by the governor. The emergency manager has never been elected and is making the city's financial decisions by decree. With a stroke of a pen, he is doing all the highly unpopular things that make bankers very, very happy. He is cutting the pensions of retirees. He is privatizing city services. His latest project has been raising the price of water, and in addition to that, shutting off the water of anyone who is behind on their water bill. Some people who are a mere $150 behind on their bills have had their water turned off. In compliance with a direct order from Kevin Orr, the emergency manager, a total of over 17,000 households in Detroit have no running water. Wow. Many people are behind on their bills because the price of water is so rapidly increasing. For a low-income family, increasing the water bill from $60 a month to $100 a month can be devastating. Put this in the context of the food stamp cuts, of Detroit's mass unemployment, and you'll see why raising the water costs and then enforcing these shutoffs has been a devastating crime against the people. Kevin Orr's excuse for taking this drastic measure is that the municipal water service is highly in debt, and these are emergency measures for a financial emergency. It is interesting, however, to note that there are golf courses, country clubs, sports stadiums, and other institutions that are not owned by workers that are behind on their bills and haven't been shut off. The recent wave of shutoffs has not been targeting businesses, but only targeting working families. Underlying this devastating economic decision is the desire of Kevin Orr to sell off the municipal water system and turn it over to private corporations who can make a profit from it. Workers in Detroit filed a complaint with the United Nations. Huge protests involving the National Nurses Association and other labor unions have been taking place. And I'm proud to say that the Detroit branch of Workers' World Party, which has a long, beautiful history of organizing and building solidarity in that city, has been at the center of these protests and demonstrations. The Moratorium Now Coalition, which began over 8 years ago, is recognized in the city as the key activist group in the fight against the banks and what Abayomi Ezekwe has described as the bankers' war on Detroit. Now, Detroit was once known as Motor City. It was a center of the automotive production in this country. Workers in the auto factories made high wages and had good union contracts. And in the late 1960s and 70s, Detroit was an exceptionally radical place. In the aftermath of an urban rebellion, black auto workers formed something called the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM, a radical caucus within the United Auto Workers Union. They opposed right-wing labor leaders and their sellout labor bureaucrats, and they would even picket the UAW conventions and chant, "We finally got the news of how our dues are being used. We finally got the news of how our dues are being used." In one, they led wildcat strikes and temporary factory occupations, winning huge victories against the bosses. And in one famous incident, a black auto worker named James Johnson was being discriminated against on the job. He was wrongfully fired for taking his vacation time, so the next day he came back to work and he shot his racist boss. And in the radical atmosphere of Detroit at the time, he hired a communist lawyer named Ken Cockrell, and he was found not guilty. During this time period, a radical mayor named Coleman Young, who was closely associated with social democratic groups and the black nationalist movement, was actually elected mayor. And he ran on a platform of fighting against police brutality, and he was elected. Detroit was a center of radicalism and the black liberation movement, and in addition, Detroit was a center of anti-Zionism and opposition to Israel's crimes. The Detroit suburb known as Dearborn is the center of the Arab American community, with the highest concentration of Yemeni and Iraqi Americans of anywhere in the country. Protests in Dearborn against Israel's crimes and in support of anti-imperialist struggles in the Arab world have been some of the biggest in the country. Because of this radicalism and this legacy of resistance, the banks targeted Detroit with extreme viciousness. The concentration of black workers with a more or less militant outlook was something that the ruling class felt needed to be smashed. The crisis of predatory lending, which became a national epidemic, began in Detroit. Today, the once prosperous Motor City has neighborhoods that are entirely vacant. Every house for blocks has been foreclosed. It's just completely empty. The bankers have ripped off the city and pushed it into huge debt. And the next step was then declaring the city bankrupt and then overturning the elected government and abolishing any notion of democracy within Detroit city limits at all. Detroit, with poverty, mass privatizations, growing police brutality, and an unelected, quote, emergency manager, is the model for what the rest of the United States and Europe is gradually going to become as the financial crisis continues. The plan of Wall Street is for straight-up dictatorship by the bankers, the direct rule of the bankers and billionaires with no right to vote, and all kinds of cops and prisons to enforce their rule with terror. The water shutoffs in Detroit, the cuts in food stamps, the war against government workers and their right to form unions are all directly linked to the rise in police brutality, the NSA spying program, the legalization and acceptance of torture, and the further suppression of civil liberties. As capitalism decays, it begins to shed its democratic cover, and the fascism that has always been there reveals itself. Now, I began this talk by reading from the Declaration of Independence and going over the hypocrisy of this rhetoric about freedom and democracy that we always hear. But there are certain things in the history of this country that are worth being proud of. Harriet Tubman, who led the Underground Railroad and also led Union soldiers into battle against the slave owners, is something to be proud of. The industrial workers of the world, the militant labor union that battled for the 8-hour day and fought the bosses from coast to coast, is something to be proud of. The workers in Flint, Michigan, who occupied their factories during the sit-down strike wave, are something to be proud of. William Z. Foster, the communist labor leader who led the unemployment councils and the battles in the streets here in New York City, is something to be proud of. The Black Panther Party of Huey Newton and Fred Hampton are something to be proud of. The history of class struggle, of resistance, the battle of the common people against the billionaires, the struggle to drive the money changers out of the temple, the struggle to break down racism, sexism, and other horrors and oppression. This is something we can look back on with pride and take inspiration from. This is the history of the United States that we don't want to forget, but they are always trying to rob from us. It's much more important than George Washington's cherry tree or the myth of the first Thanksgiving. And Workers' World Party has been part of that history over the last 50 years and is currently writing new chapters. In Detroit, testimony from Comrade Chris Amell was key in the hearings that took place, exposing Kevin Orr's crimes against the people. Before the judge, our comrade exposed the facts about the water shutoffs and what they're really doing. We had the brilliance to use the boss's courtroom as a pulpit to expose the crimes of the system and to rally the masses for a revolt. It was members of our party who built huge rallies outside of the courtrooms as well in Detroit. Recently, it was lawyers associated with our party, testimonies from members of our party, and activism in the streets led by our party that forced this crisis to be addressed. Kevin Orr has been forced to hand control of the water resources back over to the elected government. Mayor Mike Duggan is now in charge of the water, and until August 28th, there will be no more water shutoffs. A moratorium has been declared. The Moratorium Now Coalition, along with many other forces, has filed a class action lawsuit against the utility shutoffs, highlighting the fact that the bankruptcy of Detroit was caused by the rip-off policies of the banks, which loan money to the city, not people paying their water bills late. City officials are making statements about money being provided for those who cannot afford their water bills, and they even actually staged a water affordability fair on August 2nd. The city is now saying it'll accept 10% down payments to prevent water shutoffs. The crisis is far from over, and this victory is only temporary. But it was the intervention of revolutionary forces that played a key role in raising the issue of water shutoffs and creating and escalating the unrest that forced the banker class to step back for a moment and halt the water shutoffs. Now, I just want to end making this point. It's a difficult thing to be a revolutionary party and to maintain a balance. As a revolutionary Marxist organization, Workers' World Party fights for the overturning of capitalism and the creation of socialism. We want the United States as we know it to be abolished. We want the banks, factories, industries, and land to be owned by the people, like they are in Cuba and People's Korea. We want a new government with a new constitution written by the people in their struggle for justice. But that's not enough. If all we had was a vision for a future society, we wouldn't be worth anything more than your average paperback science fiction novel. To be a revolutionary party, you must also be a party of reform. It sounds contradictory, but it's not. As the capitalists abolish democratic rights, we must be the party that fights for democratic rights. As the capitalists lower the wages, we must be the party that fights to raise the wages. We must fight for $15 an hour. We must fight to be the party that's fighting to halt the water shutoffs. We must fight against police brutality, fight against the growing prison system, and fight against all attacks on the working class. But as we fight for that, we are building a revolutionary movement, an independent working class movement that holds up a vision for the future. It is very difficult to do this correctly and maintain a revolutionary outlook while building the necessary struggles and building up the working class movement. But in Detroit, here in New York, in Los Angeles, in Baltimore, in Boston, in North Carolina, the experienced leaders of our party are showing that they know what they're doing. As the struggle expands for equality and democracy, and our party expands its influence, and the class struggle grows and escalates, I have a feeling that things here in this city and here around the country are going to get a lot more exciting.